Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll begin in just a few moments, but please be sure to check your audio and visual settings if you haven't done so already. Our presentation will begin shortly. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll begin in just a few minutes, but please be sure to check your audio and visual settings if you haven't done so already. Our presentation will begin shortly. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, the latest in our Sage Talk series, Teaching Research Methods in Criminology and Criminal Justice, Challenges and Tips. So let me begin by introducing you to our speaker, Callie Marie Rennison. So Callie Rennison is a professor at the University of Colorado, Denver, and has taught a variety of undergraduate and graduate courses, including research methods, statistics, murder in America, crime in the media, and introduction to criminal justice. She earned her PhD in 1997 in political science at the University of Houston, University Park. Her research focuses on the nature, extent, and consequences of violent victimization with an emphasis on research methodology, quantitative analysis, and measurement, especially in regards to the National Crime Victimization Survey. Her research examines violence against women, violence against minority groups such as African Americans and Hispanics, crime data, and victim interaction with the criminal justice system. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and to access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. If any of you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box to the right of your screen, and one of our helpful team members will get back to you as soon as possible. At the end of the webinar, we will have some time for a Q&A session from attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag, #SageTalks, and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there as well. We'll do our best to get all the questions answered, but if we are not able to get to all of them today, we will allow Callie the opportunity to respond to those offline, and we'll include a link to the answers after our event. Without further ado, let me turn the mic over to Callie Rennison.
Good morning. Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining me for this webinar, and I also want to thank Sage for hosting this event. I think that many of us recognize that research methods as well as statistics are frequently the most dreaded classes that students take, and often the most dreaded classes for some professors, but it really doesn't have to be this way. So today I wanted to talk about 3 related approaches that I find are effective when I teach these classes. They are focusing on the why. It's number 1. We really have to emphasize why we do everything we do in research methods. Without understanding why something is done or why something is important, students don't develop a foundation for the information that this class offers. Tip number 2, focus on relevance. We must clearly identify why what we do in research methods is relevant to students in and out of the classroom. There are several ways to do this, but in the end, the students have to see how knowing this material is valuable to them. And finally, tip number 3 is making it fun. This material is fun, and it's up to us to show that research is a fun thing to do and that it's something that our students can engage in. So before I get into some of these details, I wanted to let you know that I have a lot of resources on my webpage at the University of Colorado, Denver. They include, but aren't limited to, this PowerPoint, assignments I'll talk about, some journal articles I use, syllabi, and other assorted information. If you go to my webpage and you scroll to the bottom of it, you should see these resources. And happily, there's not many Callie Rennisons out there in Denver, so if you just Google my name in Denver, it should be pretty easy to find in a search. So tip number 1, focus on why. Too often I see classes in which professors just dive into material without explaining why. So I can't overemphasize enough that we have to talk about the why in everything we do. If someone doesn't understand why, they just have no context to place this information or to access it and use it well later. So addressing the why question must be done frequently and repeatedly. Explain to students why they're taking the class. Explain why research methods are important for them to know and use, why each chapter is being covered, why each concept is being covered. Explain why each piece of information you want them to learn is important for them to know and use. I find it really useful to illustrate these whys with timely examples, and also I find it useful to illustrate the whys with examples of failures. For instance, be able to share with students specific examples of what happens when one fails to sample well, or to design a survey with a messed up skip pattern. Students remember the disasters better than simple information on how they should do things. So as an example, I wanted to address the why study research methods question. There are many reasons why we should study research methods. And the first is to build knowledge. Methods are directly related to what we think we know about something. Second, to answer interesting and important questions. Third, to become critical consumers of and creators of information. And fourth, why study research methods? Well, to become a researcher. In fact, in my classes, I treat students like researchers. I call them researchers, and I talk about the research that they're doing. Students have to see themselves as researchers and not believe that researchers are some imaginary people out there doing this stuff. Finally, a major reason to know this material is because these skills lead to jobs and careers for these students. This is something students are very interested in. So some examples of research I use to spark discussion in my class and are shown here on this slide. You can press students as to why they like or dislike some research findings. So, for example, I like to ask students about violence against women estimates from the National Violence Against Women Survey and the NCBS. We look at how different these estimates are, and I'll ask students, well, which one is right, and why do they think which one's right? Or asking about crime estimates from the FBI and BJS. Which of these crime estimates are better? Why is that? Or asking students talking about timely things about college student victimization statistics from Krebs et al., Bonnie Fisher's work, or NCBS data. Which of these estimates correct, and why do students think that? In this discussion, several things should come out. First, asking which is right or better is really the wrong question. We have to understand that each study or data set is different in terms of the methods used. What we should be doing is asking about how samples differ, how questions used to gather the data differ, how definitions differ, how modes of data collection differ. Students need to understand that the differences in methods explain the differences in findings. And students should learn that given research methods differences, the different findings coming out of these studies are not surprising and even expected. So in this exercise, students should see how they can make these distinctions themselves and how they can become more critical consumers of information they encounter. This is accomplished by understanding research methods. I find a related homework assignment after this particular lecture is to have students bring in an example of research and to share with the class how the specific research methods used to reach these findings mattered. So major tip number 2 is making research methods relevant. We can't assume that students understand why this material is relevant to them in and out of class. This material is more than just a required course, and we have to really spell it out for them. I think there are many ways we can do that. First, have students focus on how research method skills are used in the real world to solve problems. Have them find applied work used in the real world. Have them compile a list of companies or jobs that use research method skills, or use the consulting business approach in class, which I'll discuss in a little bit, so they can see themselves as users of this material. Second, relevance can be conveyed by using interesting examples of research. You can have students locate examples of interesting research and share them with class, have them bring them and share why they think it's interesting. And also, I find that students really love to find examples of bad research or bad statistics that come out of research. They can talk to people in class about why they're bad and how the methods went into that. I have some assignments on the resource page that you might want to check out related to this. A third way to indicate relevance is to point out specifically during class the things that the students are doing that can be legitimately added to their resumes. So if you have them using SPSS, then they should be able to add basic SPSS skills to their resume. If you have them creating and administering a survey, they should add basic survey construction research skills to their resume. Students often don't realize that the real skills they're learning in this class do apply to the real world, and you need to tell them that. So relevance is really highlighted by using great text. And there are some good books out there, but what is it we kind of want to find? Whoops, skipped a page, sorry. Using great books. So what is it you want? Contemporary and accurate information. I really want to focus on reasonable costs. I also like lightweight books, so we don't have to be pack mules. And having useful online resources really makes your life and students' lives much easier. One example of a really great book is Joel Best's Damn Lies and Statistics. And I start this in every single class I teach. We start with this book because it's designed for a general audience. So it really eases students into the material covered in research methods with good examples. I find students are hooked on this book right away. It's also small enough that students can read it in one evening. So it demonstrates the importance of research methods and stats and how these topics affect what we know. It talks about becoming a critical consumer and having students learn to ask questions about samples, definitions, measurement, and analyses. It's also nice in that it's small and inexpensive and it's been on the market long enough. There's lots of used copies. Students really get into this book, but one thing to keep in mind is that you have to manage that they become very critical consumers of information. So I find that it offers some really easy ways for them to learn to be critical, but you have to then kind of reel them back by saying, well, this is great. I like how you can criticize this work, but how would you do it better? And this really gets the deeper understanding about some of the challenges in research. So Joel Best starts off the book with what he calls the worst statistic ever. And what this statistic was, he saw it in a dissertation. It says every year since 1950, the number of school children gunned down in America has doubled. So at first glance, this may seem a reasonable statistic, but Best notes that with a little critical thinking, it's clearly preposterous. So consider the table of numbers I show here. Assume only one child was gunned down in 1950. I used Excel to double that number each year since 1950. And look at what this statistic would mean today, or even 20 years ago. Note that the first highlighted number in 1965 is over 3 times larger than all the people murdered in the U.S. that year. Consider that the second highlighted number in 1980 is more than 4 times the population of the United States that year. And in 1983, that number is more than 2 times the world's population at the time. Finally, the last highlighted number I have here in 1987 surpasses the estimated number of people to have ever walked on the face of the earth. So what had happened is that the original person, or the person writing the dissertation, had mangled the original statistic. The original statement was that the number of children gunned down since 1950 had doubled, not that it had doubled each year. A little critical thought in the use of Excel clearly demonstrates that this may be the worst statistic ever. So tip number 3, making it fun. There really are ways to address the why questions to make the material relevant and to make this material fun for everyone. One way I do it is by using really fun examples of published research. I offer a few of them on my resources page. One of them is by Johnson and Cruz from 2012 and is titled, My Professor is Hot, Correlates of RateMyProfessor.com Ratings for Criminal Justice and Criminology Faculty Members. Students really love this article because it's easy to read. They understand what Rate My Professor is, and so it makes it very easy to talk to them the methodology that goes into this work. In addition, if you're doing some basic statistics like correlations, this article is really excellent for them to understand exactly what is going on. I also find that sharing research that students in your own department did is a way to make this material fun. I use a piece by Jennifer Kobina from 2008. She was a student where I was a professor at the time, and this is a paper that she started as a student in graduate school. It focuses on the media portrayal of crack cocaine versus meth users and the relationship of this portrayal to victim race. It's a valuable piece of research, and it's easy for students to understand what is happening methods-wise. It emphasizes to students in your class that they too can be researchers. I've even used this as a model for research proposals in classes like crime in the media. It's also available online. I find it's especially fun to share disasters with students. Show them clearly what happens when the topic you're covering is not done well, and show them why that matters. So I share as an example of a survey that a student did that failed to provide an exhaustive list of marital status. The researcher forgot to put the category married in, so you can talk about what that means for the research. Or there's an example of a student who created a survey and forgot to include a question for their dependent variable. What does this mean for that research? It's not good. And I share my own bumps in the road when I was a young researcher, like the time that I learned not to double side print my survey. What I learned there is that people don't look on the back of pages. So I had a pretty big mess that I had to clean up. So some of this fun comes in simplifying the language. Some of the language, especially if you're teaching statistics, can be very off-putting. Acknowledge that it can be confusing and offer ways to simplify it. For example, for levels of measurement, I draw the word in big capital letters noir, N-O-I-R, and we talk about what this means. In French, it means black. And then we talk about how this is a good way to remember nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio levels of measurement. If you're dealing with some basic statistics, which many methods classes do, I talk to them about what does standard mean when you see it. It usually just means average. And what does deviation mean? It usually just means distance. And suddenly a standard deviation is something that's easy to comprehend as the average distance of a score from a mean. These sorts of simplification and translating jargon to English is very useful and can be fun. So I want to talk about several specific approaches that I use to make this stuff fun, aside from what I've already mentioned. One of the cool things about this is that if you use all of these different approaches, the students learn the material via reading, listening, writing, and speaking, not in just one way to communicate. And I think this helps cement the information in their brain as well. So the first example is a consulting business, and this is really fun. On the first day of class, I tell students that they need to decide on the name of their consulting business and their official title at that business. So I provide homework to them many nights in the form of a client who needs some assistance with a problem. The student must address the client's concern with a formal, professional, and written response that I grade. There is a how to write a consulting report document in the resources, and I ask them to follow this particular template. So examples of client issues can include identifying bad statistics or identifying unethical research or creating a survey, developing focus group questions, etc. This approach ends up being really fun and increases student engagement. The students learn to write about what they know and to do so in a very non-methodologically jargony way that everybody can understand. It's also an opportunity to be creative, and I find that students do enjoy that. So for example, these are just a few of the consulting materials that my students hand in as a result of their consulting businesses. I'm half surprised that they're not getting business cards by the end of class. Another approach that I use is in-class conference presentations. When students come in, they're handed a problem, much like the consulting business take-home homework, except they have to deal with it in class. The setting or context is that we're at a professional conference. So students get a little time to look over their problem, and then they've got to make a presentation that addresses the issue they were given. In this assignment, students learn to present about methods orally, and they learn to think on their feet. So what I teach them, and what they quickly become very good at, is to stand up, to thank the audience for coming, to state what the problem is, to state how they will solve it and why that's the best way to solve it, and then to even offer policy recommendations if it's appropriate for the assignment. They're encouraged to do this without using jargon. So my role during this conference presentation is that I'm an audience member, and I interrupt them and ask lots of questions. For example, I'll ask, well, why do you do it that way? Why don't you do it this other way? Why is this even important to consider? What do you mean by that? Why not do it the way that my uncle at the dinner table said I should do it? This is a way to really dig deep for students to see if they understand deeply why they're doing things, why it's important, and things like that. If a student struggles with some of the material, I offer them ways to respond. And this helps them to better understand that material. So I'll ask the same questions so they'll have an opportunity to respond correctly. So we'll practice it until they get it right. Not only do they learn the material, but they build some confidence in the way that they're saying it and presenting it to the audience. Over time, students in the audience also learn to offer advice and to ask helpful questions to the speaker. It turns out that this approach really facilitates a rich learning environment, and one that I think students find is a safe place to not always be right, and it's a way that they learn. At the conclusion of the presentation, the speaker asks for questions, addresses any, and then thanks the audience. And in turn, the audience applauds their effort. Not only is this great for learning material, but it's great professional skills for later on. Another approach I use is using lots of fake quizzes. And I've got a few of them on the resource page. So students take these quizzes without knowing they're coming. I go over the answers in class and students grade their own work. The grade on these quizzes do not affect their class grades. So why do this? It's really useful for material that students struggle with, but for some reason don't want to ask questions about. I've never understood why, but independent and dependent variables are a really good example of this. Students almost act embarrassed when they don't grasp this concept right away. This approach forces them to recognize, to see themselves where weaknesses are in their understanding of the material, and I think it motivates them to study more and to start asking questions in the future. A really nice part of this is that it reduces the soul-crushing and grade destruction at exam time. I usually only give 2 exams a semester at most, and so if they learn at the exam they didn't get it, it's already too late. Another example is in-class group work. So I like to use at least 2 times a semester some in-class work. While I personally don't really understand the appeal of this approach, but I'm much older, I can say that students really like it. Students work in small groups on assignments and then as a group offer their findings in the context of an in-class conference presentation. I found two examples that work really well with this, but it could certainly be expanded. And one of them is field research activity. If you're in the right situation, you can even, and have enough time, you can send students out for an hour to do some sort of observation and then come back and report out. And also secondary data analysis. The last approach to making this fun is you. You really matter. There's no substitute for a professor who loves this topic. Your love for it, your excitement for it will be apparent and contagious, so don't hold back. This stuff is fun. If you don't love research, if you don't love statistics, if you don't believe it's important for students to learn and use, then you'll never convince students otherwise. So in sum, show students the why. Without a firm grip of why, the material makes little to no sense. Demonstrate why research methods are relevant. You can do that with text, you can do that with highlighting failure and bad statistic and lots of other ways I've talked about. And 3, making research methods fun and accessible for students through things like creative assignments, group work, low-stakes testing, etc. So in conclusion, there may be a few students who grumble and groan at the beginning, but I have found that without failure, at the end, they all really get into it and they learn the material. You'll find that you enjoy teaching it. You'll enjoy grading the assignments more as well. I think students love to become competent critical consumers, and also becoming able to offer other ways to do things is a great skill. So even the research papers, surveys, consulting reports become a great source of interest. Students want to do them and they go the extra mile to make them done well. And having learned this material, many students end up interning and gaining employment as analysts in local agencies using these skills. It is rare for me to have a class where several of my students are not getting a job, interning, or doing capstones using the skills they learn in this class. So I want to thank you for listening. I hope you found a few tips that are useful or you can build off of. So let me know if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Callie, for your presentation. So now we're going to move on to our Q&A session. So again, we're answering questions that have come through on the Q&A box to the right or the bottom of the main presentation screen, or those that have come from Twitter using the hashtag SageTalk. And then finally, if we can't get to all the questions by the end, Callie has kindly agreed to address them in a follow-up blog post on our Sage blog, Sage Connection. We've had a couple of questions come in. The first question for you, Callie, is most of my students want to go into law enforcement. What techniques do you use to show students who want to work in criminal justice why research methods actually matters for them in regards to law enforcement?
That's a really great question. I think that it's really important for anybody working in the criminal justice system to have a firm grip on how we know what we know. So, I think that even if somebody is going to become a police officer, it doesn't mean that they're not going to have to look at research that's been done. Or if they want to get promoted eventually, they're going to need to be aware of research findings and the latest, what we think are the best ways to do that. The only way they can do that is to get into some journal articles or get into some other kind of easier to access things based on research, but to understand how that research was put together, right? So if they're given a best practice as a law enforcement officer, I think that it behooves them to look at how did they know that that's the best practice and what went into that research. And having basic research method skills, I think, will do it for them. So there's that part of it. But I also think, too, that most people want to, over time, advance in their career. And having that grip on policy, having that grip on research methods that goes into creating that policy is necessary for that sort of advancement.
Perfect. Thank you. I have another one. I will be teaching a writing enhanced research methods course in the fall. Do you have any suggestions for fun or relevant writing assignments?
Oh yeah, another great question. I really think this consulting business model would be something that you could really, really get into. Like I said, the papers that students write, it's more than a page, but I teach them to talk about what is the problem, why is it an important problem, how will I solve this problem, solving it, and then explaining it in English what that means, and then offering the client suggestions about what they should do next. And this is a fair amount of writing that goes into it, and it needs to be accurate and it needs to be jargon-free. So I think it helps the students develop some really important skills that are useful in the real world. A long time ago when I worked at the Department of Justice, I was sitting there during my job interview, and I heard something I've never forgotten, obviously, since I'm saying it now, but I had asked the person who was interviewing me. I was really shocked they were interested in hiring me because I know a lot of people who can do SPSS and who can do the things, you know, that you learn in research methods. And so when they got to the point in the interview where he said, so do you have any questions? My question was, and I don't recommend this for an interview, I said, well, why do you want me? And he said, well, I know a lot of people who can write, and I know a lot of people who can use SPSS, but it's rare to find a person who can do both. And so I think if you can incorporate that into these assignments, and I think the consulting business does it, especially if it's using SPSS, then you're giving the student a real skill that will help them advance in the real world.
Great, thank you. So another one, I often find my students don't take into account the importance of ethics in research, and it's so important. They understand blatantly unethical behavior, but not the more subtle points. How do you bring in discussion of ethics into your classroom?
Oh, that's another really good question, and one that really matters to me. And I fully admit that I think that people involved in the criminal justice system should be held to a higher standard of ethics, and so it's so important. And in fact, and I didn't talk about it in here, but I finished a book with my colleague Tim Hart in the summer on research methods, and a huge emphasis in that book has to do with ethics. That one of the things that our book is different is that it's not like chapter 2 is ethics. Every single chapter talks about it, about every single step in research, about the ethical considerations that we have to make and take. Because I agree, I think too often people think that, you know, okay, I have to do IRB, better be ethical, and other than that, they forget about it. So I ask for a desk copy of the book so you can kind of see how I think in the book that we've talked about it throughout the entire process is the best way for me to answer that, I think. But I agree, every class it should be brought up. When you're creating a survey, what ethical considerations are you going through? Hey, even if you've got IRB approval to talk to a certain group, is it really the right thing to do? We have to stop and ask ourselves and ask our colleagues to check us too.
Perfect. Another question. What are some tips for teaching research methods in an online environment, if you have any?
Yeah, that's harder, isn't it? I laugh at some people who say that online teaching is easier than in-person teaching, and usually the people who say that have never taught online. It can be more challenging, and some of these assignments are a little harder to do. If you have good technology like Zoom, then you can still do these conference presentations and some group work. But I think that you have to take advantage of all the technology is a big part of it. Using the sort of things when you have online resources available, but also as a lecturer, it's easy to just put up notes and move on, but I think taping your lectures are really important. One thing that I do is that I often will have lots of thought papers. So there's small little questions, and it's almost like the same thing you have as for discussion questions. And I actually assign them as written papers, like 2-3 page responses, and I grade them one-on-one. And so I get into a personal dialogue with each student and give them writing tips as well, because this is something that I think students need regardless of the class. But I recognize that's a lot of work, and in some of these gigantic sessions or sections, that's not going to be possible. And I hate myself every semester I do it because it is a lot of work, but I have to say that it's really good for the students and they get a lot out of it. So yeah, you just have to, I think, seeing the live person, trying to do Zooms where you can get people to come together a little bit, having students record their conference presentations if you can't all coordinate timing, some of the things like that. I think technology makes it easier to do, but it is still work.
All right. Have you tried incorporating service learning in your research methods class? Can you share a little bit about your experience or thoughts in general?
Sure. And correct me if I'm not understanding what you mean by service learning. I have to say that my classes, we don't have time to kind of connect with the real world as much in the classes. However, students, you'll probably find if you teach research methods and you've got students who are doing like a final project for their degree, we have capstones where I am, that these often, I try to convince students to think about that topic now and to keep it moving, and then they're working out with a client in the real world and doing something that is useful for that client. I think that's really important for lots of reasons. Again, because it lets students see that these skills are really useful to people out there, that people need these skills. This is networking, they can get a job, and they often get a job, but also just because, why do we do research? We do it to build knowledge, and we don't build knowledge just because it's fun. We do it because we're trying to make a better world. So yeah, I think that's what I'm all about. I wish I could do more of it in my classes, like during the class time, but over the long haul, I'm able to do it better. And let me say too that when I teach, students have to take research methods, and then we have a separate statistics course, and then it usually goes into their capstone. So I just view this as like a year and a half teaching a big class in that way. So it does give us a little bit more time, and I can connect them to people out there too.
All right. So this person said, the class presentation and consulting sounds great, but how do you deal with students who just freeze or tend not to care about the questions the instructor or other students are asking as soon as they're done presenting their work?
You know, I'd like to think that I have the best students ever, but honestly, it's not too big of a problem, and it might take a class or two. Number one, they see they're going to have to do it anyway. Number two, if you look at some of the examples I use for these, they're a little bit humorous, so it allows them an opportunity to put some jokes in there too, but I can still see that they're getting the material. Number three, and this is a situation I had, is I had a young lady who came from a particular culture that to stand up in front of the class and speak was not something that she could do or was comfortable with. And so in that situation and for that class, I just put teams of two. And so students were teams, and she would do some of the written work, and her teammate would do the actual presentation. So I think there are ways to work around it. You get to know your students and which ones are struggling. Also, as that person who's asking questions, don't just ask them questions about things that they obviously don't know. Ask them questions about things they know. So you can say, why did you do it that way? And sometimes they'll look at you like, oh my God, I did it wrong. And I'll encourage them, I go, no, tell me why. And they'll say, well, because ratio levels to the highest level of measurement. And I'll be like, exactly, great job. So you can use those opportunities, not just to point out what they're not getting, use those opportunities to help to build their confidence that they do know this material. I mean, some of them might struggle a little bit throughout, but I think that they quickly learn that it is a safe environment. We're here to help. We want you to learn it and be successful. And I think it does come across. Hopefully I don't jinx myself and have some terrible student the next time I teach this who doesn't get into it. But I think they learn that's the culture of the class, is that we're all in there doing it, and they're going to do it too.
Great. This one might be on your website, Callie. Someone asked, what was the title of the research article on Rate My Professor? That sounds like a great and fun example to go over in class, and I would love to use it.
Yeah, it's I think it starts off, my professor is hot, and it is on my webpage. It's Johnson and Cruz 2012. It is a fabulous article for this. Not only do they understand kind of what's happening research methods wise, but as we get into more like correlations, if you're in a statistics class, they start offering things like, well, they didn't account for this. And then you can turn the page in the article and literally the authors accounted for it next. You can say, well, let's see what happens. That article, probably more than any I've shared, students understand and really come out of it, getting it. and knowing that they get it and feeling confident too that they can do this kind of work. It's a great article. Someday I'm going to meet the authors of it and just thank them profusely. It's been so useful.
Okay, I'm all on board for making research methods fun, but how do I do that and still make sure my students have a foundational understanding of that less than fun material?
Well, I'm not really sure what the less than fun material is, because when you can tie it to failures, it becomes kind of fun, which maybe is a weird way to look at it. But if you, again, talk about, let's see, reliability, and you're, just saying, okay, this is what reliability is, blah, 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 boring, boring, boring. But if you can talk about a place where somebody did it poorly and the disastrous outcomes and laugh about it, especially if it's your own work, I do think it's fun. I don't know if you have a specific example of some material and maybe how I approach it, then I can give a more specific answer. And let me say this too, that I have found, the book that I ended up writing with Tim was the class that I've been teaching. So it has the things in it I want. I have found that, no book is perfect, and mine's likely not perfect either, but some of them get into detail on certain things in methods that I don't really know that students get anything out of. So it might just be that some of it isn't relevant for where they are in their research career. I've never had a problem with saying, let's not go that deep into this. Let's move on. I look at my students as I want them to walk out of the class, be able to, do their capstone, do some basic research, and then if they choose to go on for their PhD, or advanced degree, that they can take additional classes then. My goal in research methods is to show them that it's cool, you do good stuff, it can be fun, and to motivate them to continue on. I hope I answered your question.
Great. My goal for the class is for my students to think more critical about data sources and how data is interpreted and manipulated. Do you have any tips on how to get them to think more critically?
Yeah, Joel Best's book. I don't know if you've used it or not, but he does a really, really great job in making it super approachable for students. And I'm not joking when I say that students become hyper critical. Like one example that I'll use in the book is we'll talk about stalking. And we'll talk about, well, let's look at stalking numbers. Now let's look at how stalking is defined. And it doesn't take much for them to tear into definitions of stalking that we use to create estimates in this nation. And they'll just shred it. And then that's when I'll say, okay, well, let's think about it. How might you do this differently? And that's where it becomes hard, right? Because the reason we're using the definitions we're using is they're the best we've got right now. So I think if you're not using Joel Best yet, you really need to use it, and it'll be great. They'll become excellent critical consumers. And I don't know if you're not familiar with it, in the back he even has a typology of people and how they use definitions, and he talks about the critical consumer and the cynical consumer, and talks about who you don't want to be. You don't want to be the person who actually does manipulate data for your own end. That isn't research, that isn't good, and that's not ethical. So it gives them a good idea too about you are aiming to be a critical consumer of information, not one of these other people. There's a right and a wrong way to do research. You need to do it right.
Great. And then we have another question on writing. My students often struggle with the writing process, and when it comes to research methods, particularly literature reviews. Do you have any tips for helping me through this?
Oh yeah, and again, I didn't do this for this reason, but the book that we just finished, I think it's chapter 3 is devoted to writing literature reviews, because I run into the same issue. I think you pick up a lot of research methods books and it starts with sampling, and we just assume students know how to write lit reviews, and they don't. And then we've written our syllabus and we haven't made time to learn how to write lit reviews, and then we're shocked they don't know how to write lit reviews. So it was one of the things I wanted to do in this book, is so that we can schedule into our class time how to do it. And in the book there are specific tips called the meal plan, about writing it, gathering the material, synthesizing the material, and putting it together. So I think if you look at that, it'd be very useful for that. But I agree with you. I think it's the biggest challenge. I've often thought about even wanting to teach a literature review writing class, because I think students could benefit from that. I hope that's helpful too.
Great. That is it on questions. Any last questions? Please send them now. We'll give it like 10 more seconds. All right. No more questions. Thank you so much. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for today's SAGE Talk. And thank you so much again, Callie. Please be on the lookout for an email that will include a link to view this entire webinar on our website. And thank you again for your attention. And we hope you'll join us for another SAGE Talk webinar again soon. You can visit sagepub.com/SageTalk for more information. Have a great day, everybody.